Hey everyone, Power Word Heal here, and we've got a banger for you today. So we've saved the best for last, the holy Chad Paladin, the strongest class in the game. but yeah, seriously, we're going to be going over Paladin runes today. And in case you don't know what a rune is, I always break that down in the first part of the video. So basically a rune is like an augment that you can put on slots of gear. Right now, it's only on the chest, the legs, and gloves can have these types of augments, these runes. But in the future, it's been hinted that we're going to get potentially some other slots. So you could have, theoretically, all of your gear having runes on it, although we're not sure if that's going to be the case yet. And currently, there's only this amount of augments. Sometimes there's like 4 or 3 per slot, but those are also going to be expanded upon, or at least it's been hinted at. So we're probably going to have more options than these. And you can only have one of these in a slot at a time. But right now we're just going to cover this stuff because it's the only stuff available. And there's a lot of juicy stuff here, honestly. There's a lot of kind of, I would say, class or meta-defining abilities that have been getting put in these. So let's jump right in. And we will look at the chest talents. And just one more thing to say about these is that they can kind of be either passives, so think more like talent orientated, or they can just give you active abilities, or in some cases they can give you both. Like there's a warlock one where you get chaos bolt, but it also makes like your fire damage penetrate shields and stuff like that. So there can be a mix and match in these. And we're going to be basically talking about it from the PvE healing perspective. I just don't want to get too bogged down with PvP and stuff like that because, there'll just be too much to cover. There's already a lot to cover just with from a healing perspective. And I may make some notes for other potential uses for some of these. Like in this tier 1, we're actually going to go into something kind of right off the bat. Because it may be related to healing in some ways. So going right into it, Horn of Lordaeron is probably going to be what you're going to choose as a Holy Paladin. And we'll get into that in a second, but we'll just kind of go across the board here. And you're not going to really be using Divine Storm as a Holy Paladin, right? Because even if you have, like maybe they add a 2-hand weapon that's like a 2-hand mace or something, that actually has like a high top end and really good healing stats, but it's probably going to cost a decent amount of mana to cast Divine Storm, and healing the raid for 25% of the damage caused or the party just doesn't seem like a lot. So I really doubt you're going to be using that. You're not really going to be using Aegis as a Holy Paladin, and you're not really going to be using Seal of Martyrdom from what I could tell. I feel like a Seal of Martyrdom could have potential uses for a Holy Paladin in maybe like 5-man content or like smaller scale content, because in those types of situations, you're going to be able to not have to heal as much typically, which means you're going to have more free time so you can attack more, right? Because if you're in a raid, you're not typically doing a lot of attacking, which means your use out of Seal of Martyrdom is going to be quite limited, especially because you probably already don't do a lot of damage to begin with. So in order to get decent mana out of it, you'd probably need to attack pretty often, and you can attack while casting spells, so that's kind of a bit of a problem. But before we leave off Martyrdom, I do want to talk about a couple potential uses for this that are outside of Holy. So Ret and Prot come to mind, and they're both interesting to me because I think this Seal of Martyrdom could actually provide a lot of mana return for a party in both of those cases being used in Ret or Prot. Now, I think what that's going to be contingent on is exactly how the seal works. So it's kind of like a cleave seal, as you can see, 30% weapon damage to up to 3 nearby targets, and then you lose health equal to the damage inflicted. But what I'm wondering is if there's only a single target available, does that target count as like one of the targets? So for example, are you still gaining mana to the group by just doing damage to one target. And if that is the case, then that's pretty good because it's still useful on even single target fights. And I feel like there's a lot of single target fights in the game, or fights that become single target at least. And if it's not the case, and you need to have cleave targets to get that mana increased effect, or the mana gain effect, then it's not quite as good. Although, to be honest, there's still a lot of fights that involve some portion of cleave. For example, on a fight like Lucifron, until all the adds are dead, you would have a nice steady stream of mana coming in, which would be really helpful in that fight because it tends to be a bit of a marathon fight where you're burning a lot of mana over the course of it as a healer, and by the end things really get tight, right? So if you have a lot of mana regen at the start, that can still be super beneficial for a fight like Lucy or something like that. So maybe in that case you would put your Holy Paladins or your Priests in a group with a Ret Paladin, or in a group with the tank or something like that. I think that potentially it'd be easier to put them in a tank group because the Rets probably want to benefit from some of the other melee buffs. So I think it'd be easiest to probably put this on a tank and have them provide the mana regen to the healers, but we'll have to see how all that stuff gets ironed out. I don't really think that the damage coming in from you doing damage would be a problem because on a tank he's going to be getting healed anyway. He probably has a bunch of beacons on him. If it was a Ret that was doing this, you could beacon the Ret because you'll probably have enough beacons to go around, or you could just kind of like spot heal him, like as if kind of you would do now if a target has like a dot on them or something like that. Just be cognizant of that. And I don't know, I think it could be really powerful depending on how it works. And for Pra, it's kind of competing with Aegis, I guess you would say. But the thing about Aegis is that block in this game is not really an amazing stat, I feel like, for tanking. Or at least it's not as good as you would think. It's not like PoE block, for example, where you block the entire damage of the attack. So the damage you block when you block in WoW is based on your block value, and it tends to be relatively small. I believe it's usually in like the hundreds or something like that, and these hits can be like 1k, 1.5k, so it's not insignificant at all, but it's not like you block the whole 1k hit or a 1.5k hit or a 3.5k crit. It's nothing like that. And this does increase your block value on Aegis, so that's good, but it's still 30% of a relatively low number. What I could see Aegis being really good for is kind of like if you're AoE farming, or if you're maybe fighting a fast-hitting boss that hits quicker but doesn't hit as hard, or if you're having to tank multiple adds that all hit fast and don't hit hard, stuff like that. So kind of like AoE applications where the block is more meaningful there. I think that could be really strong, but I think on most like single target hard hitting tank fights in particular, or most like normal fights where you're tanking one target, Aegis is not really going to be super necessary for mitigation, right? And if it's not, then maybe you can easily get away with Seal of Martyrdom, and you do a bit of extra damage if there's AoE, and if not, you're still providing mana back, assuming it works that way. So I think that definitely could be pretty strong. And then as far as Ret goes, you have Divine Storm as an option, but I think it would actually just depend on how long the ads are going to be up. Because if the ads are going to get disintegrated, then something like Divine Storm is nice to be able to do that high burst damage while they are up. But if you're going to be able to continually attack for a while, Seal of Martyrdom might actually be better, right? If the ads are going to survive for quite a while and you can keep hitting them with that 30% weapon damage on every auto and stuff like that. So I think for that one, it's just going to depend on the nature of the fight. But Seal of Martyrdom, I could definitely see it being used by Ret or Prop Paladins, and it could definitely refund a lot of mana. if it's used and it works in the way that we might expect it to. So getting back to Horn of Lordaeron, and then we can finish out this rune slot. So the reason why you take this is kind of obvious as Holy Rite, because as Prot, you're either going to be taking Martyrdom or Aegis. As Ret, you're going to be taking Martyrdom or Divine Storm. So, they don't really have any room for this. In terms of, when is it good to take this? I haven't really done the math on the agility and strength versus might. So I'm not entirely sure about that, but it'll be figured out. And if it's good or if it's required, you just take it and keep it up. It's not going to be that complicated. So it may be a little bit annoying because it's like 2 minutes versus even the normal Paladin Blessing is like 5 minutes, but you can just keep a weak aura for it. And it's not really that bad because it's party only, right? So it's not like a 2-minute buff that you're casting on somebody in like group 7. That you have to like remember to keep that on him at all times or anything like that. So it should be pretty easy to handle. So moving on to the juicy bits. So the leg slot and then the glove slot. So if you saw the thumbnail, it was a little bit extra, but it was on purpose because I think both of these abilities, Divine Sacrifice and Beacon of Light, are insanely powerful and they're game changing. And I think for Divine Sacrifice, I have the listed over it, the power to change fate. And that's kind of what it is, honestly. It's a huge damage reduction, and it can completely change how you do fights. It can change whether people live or die or not. And it does do damage to the Paladin, which is, a significant drawback to keep in mind. But keep in mind, Paladins have Bubble. And they also have Bop. So assuming the damage done is reflected in the same way, you could actually maybe on fights have a Divine Sacrifice used with a Bubble, and then like a Divine Shield, and then a Divine Sacrifice used with a Bop, assuming all the damage was coming in was physical, right? So if it works like that, that would actually be really cool. It might be like true damage or something, which could go through the Bop. We're not really sure yet. But either way, you'll have it for Divine Shield, which will be useful, and then you'll still have it with without that. And you could just like spam heal the Paladin, maybe put a call for a beacon to go on that Paladin before he's about to use it. And it breaks at 20% health, so in most cases they shouldn't die. I think the one case you really have to be careful about is if there's like heavy raid damage, because it may just get broken very quickly if they don't bubble, and then once it gets broken, yeah, they're not taking damage from everybody anymore, but now they're at 20%, and they're still taking the same AoE damage presumably everybody else is, right? So that one is a bit sketchy, but I think just the use with the Divine Shield is insanely powerful. The one drawback that I'm seeing, and again, I mentioned this in pretty much all the other videos, is it mentions it's party only. So it's very similar to like the Priest Barrier and the Shaman Healing Rain and stuff like that. It seems like they want to keep these like party-based cooldowns. It almost makes me think that stuff like this was designed with like the 10-man in mind, right? Because you have like less groups, it might be easier to get more of these cooldowns to cover for certain groups. So it'll be interesting to see how the fights are designed, because in 10-man it's quite possible that you may need to use some of these damage reduction cooldowns, but in 40-man maybe they stray away from it because it's like, well, are we actually gonna expect these people to have like something like Divine Sac for every group or something like that, right? And if you don't, it could be potentially pretty problematic. The good thing is that as Alliance, you should pretty much always have access to 25 to 30% damage reduction across the entire raid if it's needed. It will probably cause you to mess up your groups a little bit, for sure, but you run enough priests and you're probably going to run, like you're going to run at least 4 priests. I mean, you're probably going to run like 6, and then you're probably going to run at least 4 paladins, right? So you have 1 for every group, and they can Divine Sack their group, Divine Sack Bubble, and then the priests can barrier their group, and you can survive very heavy raid damage. You can maybe even ignore certain mechanics. I think that might be where the use comes in for this more than just surviving, because I'm not sure that they would add like retail like raid damage that comes in where you have to use cooldowns for it, because like I said, if you're on Horde, you don't necessarily have a ton of these cooldowns available unless you have something like Barrier. And I feel like something like Shaman's Healing Rain just doesn't quite compare to Divine Sacrifice. It's much better to prevent the damage, right, than to heal like a tiny bit of it back over time with something like Healing Rain. So I think it'd be kind of unfair if they add a lot of those like heavy raid damage mechanics, because Alliance would have a huge advantage. So I think what Alliance is probably going to do is they're just going to use this to like straight up ignore certain mechanics in the fight. Maybe to like continue DPSing at a certain point or something like that. But either way, it should be very powerful, just having the utility to be able to use it whenever. So yeah, the power to change fate, Divine Sacrifice. I love it. So moving down one to the gloves, and I think this is like the real showstopper. I have this listed on the thumbnail as it's a thing about the eyes where like you can see everything, and I think it's appropriate with Beacon of Light because it's kind of like not only are you healing like more people, but I think it literally does allow you better vision in the raid, because I think one of the problems that Paladins ran into beforehand is, Flash of Light is really great spell to heal tanks. And I already went over in a different video why I don't think priests are very good at healing tanks at all. It was like the priest video. And it's just that on Horde side, they basically get told to be tank healers because Shaman's best use case is AoE by far. So therefore, you play to the Shaman's strengths, and the priest can kind of do everything. So you put the priest on the tank, but the priest isn't really that much different than the Shaman in terms of healing the tank. It's just that they have better mana regeneration, and they have shield. But the shield is not unique to the tank healing priest, right? Any priest could just toss a shield out on the tank whenever it's needed. So in reality, they're just not super good, because a lot of times you have to cast like relatively fast spells. You have to at least mix them in while casting the slower, more efficient spells, and that can put a drain on your mana for sure. You know what I mean? And as a paladin, it's super easy to heal a tank because Flash of Light is a very fast cast, so it's basically like priest flash heal, but it doesn't cost a lot of mana. And it still actually nets you a pretty sizable chunk of HPS casting it, especially because Paladins have Blessing of Light, which kind of really buffs that specific spell quite substantially, to be honest, and allows it to be like a really relevant heal, especially on something that has light, and your tank is most likely always going to have Blessing of Light. So it's pretty powerful, and then also, because it's not the hardest hitting heal, if it does crit, a lot of times the overhealing is not wasted. So it actually makes it kind of like a fairly mana efficient spell. A lot of the mana efficiency of the Paladin isn't so much the actual spells, but the illumination talent. But to be honest, Flash of Light is not as bad as you would think in terms of like an efficiency type spell, because so much of it is able to be absorbed by the tank so often. And the one issue that I was talking about though is like, because they're so good at healing the tank, and because a lot of vanilla content tends to be very spam heavy, where there's certain fights where you really just kind of want somebody almost like non-stop looking at the tank and just tossing heals on the tank, because in any given moment, like, they can be fine. It looks like the fight is going super smooth, and then out of nowhere, they'll just get like a crushing blow or a critical, they'll take a critical hit or something like that, or they'll get thrashed, and all of a sudden they're down to like 30%. And like now you really wanted to have those people that are just spamming them. So on fights like that, paladins would just like spam tanks essentially. It could honestly be like typically if you're spam healing a tank, if you're as a priest, a lot of times you are somewhat cancel casting, right? Because you do need to find ways to conserve some amounts of mana. Because if you were just like to let it rip and just flash heal, you'll go for sure. So you have to find some way to conserve mana there. But as a paladin, you could literally full send it on the tank. Just literally hold down your like whatever key flash of light is bound to, and that could be how you heal the tank on that fight. And while it would be effective at healing the tank, you're kind of tunneling, and it's taking a lot of your like attention away from the rest of the raid, so you can't really spot the raid while doing that at the same time, right? And you have priests to do the raid healing, so it's not the biggest deal. And I think that paladin and priest do have that really good synergy, because priest can spot normally really well with lower rank flash of light. It's kind of like a similar functionality to paladin's flash of light. And they can also do the big AoE healing with prayer of healing, especially now they'll have a circle of healing, right? And they'll have prayer mending. So the raid healing is not necessarily a super concern. However, it's always good having additional eyes on the raid and being able to spot. Paladins are good at spot healing. It's just that a lot of times they are healing the tank, right? So now with a beacon, it really does let you have eyes on the entire raid, because you now can take your eyes off the tank, put your beacon on the tank, set it and forget it. It's doing 100% of the healing that you do to the tank in a 60-yard radius, so you're not even having to worry like who you're healing or where you're standing 90% of the time. You know that heal is going back to the tank. I'm pretty sure it also does overhealing, because I think it just sends the heal. It just duplicates that portion of it. So you don't have to worry about like, I need to do effective healing on the raid in order to heal the tank. You know what I mean? The tank is getting healed anyway. I'm 99% sure. We'll have to see exactly how that works, but basically what this means is that you can help your entire raid by just like spot healing other people that are not the people of your beacon target, and your beacon target is just getting topped off constantly all the time. So between priest spotting, priest AoE healing, especially with prayer mending now being added into that as well, and circle of healing, and then you have some druid hots potentially on the raid, things like wild growth or whatever. And then you combine that with paladin spot healing on a 1.5 second cast that is going to have a relatively high crit chance, because we're going to have world buffs, and barely cost any mana, because like most of these are getting their mana refunded. Maybe not most, but like a third of them should easily be able to hit like 30% crit with world buffs back in the game. So it's gonna be insane, and you're choosing the target, right? So like people like to they'll go on and on for days about chain heal's like smart target this, smart target that. Well, the smartest targeting you can have is your own brain. Okay, like by far. And you being able to like precision snipe heal the people on your roster while also healing the tank with a great mana efficient spell that provides a decent chunk of healing, it's going to be like insanely powerful. There also seems like there's some sort of glyph, it was like data mined, where flash of light is having a hot component, and if that's true, that's just going to be completely disgusting. I'm not sure how that's going to work, or if it's going to like potentially take over one of these slots, but if that is actually a thing, it's going to be gross. I mean, I'm not typically a fan of HOTS, but if you're going to get it for free, then that's just completely ridiculous, right? So at that point, Paladin would be insanely strong. But yeah, I think just even how it stands right now with having Beacon in the game, people don't understand like how powerful ease of use is. And I was talking about this actually in a Discord today, where there's a conversation having to do with like alliance healing and horde healing, and it was kind of like alliance. It started as alliance versus horde in general, and then it kind of moved to the healing section. But obviously, we were talking about how in the original vanilla, you know, alliance was just easier to play, and a large portion of that was due to salvation, in my opinion, because salve obviously is kind of like a mistake eraser for the DPS, because now your DPS just don't have to worry about pulling threat, right? Like if you have a competent alliance tank, they have like especially if they have like a Thunder Fury or something like that, and everybody has salve, all the relevant DPS, they're not gonna have to be like you're not gonna have to worry about them pulling off you unless like they're like attacking before you, literally, or something like that. So it's very powerful buff, but I actually think that it's given a little bit too much credit, and it's definitely amazing, right? And it's one of the reasons why Alliance felt so much better to raid as. But I think that the actual healing on a macro level is just better on the Alliance side too, right? And a lot of it goes back to the fact that Paladins just naturally fill that tank healing role better than priests. And on Horde, you really have two AoE healers, and they're kind of competing with each other. And somebody laughed at me when I said that, and they're like, well, no, priests just heal the tank. And I'm like, well, yeah, they're forced to. They're subjugated to heal the tank on Horde, essentially. They want to be healing the raid. They don't really do good tank healing. They're not especially good at tank healing at all. And, so even though they're not technically fighting, there's not a lot of synergy between shaman and priest. And it was mentioned how actually, oh, well, what do you mean Alliance healing is better? Because Horde has the highest maximum HPS. You have chain heal and you have prayer of healing. Like, how could you say Alliance heal is better? And it's like, well, you're never going to need that type of throughput in Classic, and I'm pretty sure that won't change for sure. Even in Season of Discovery, that would just be an insane amount of throughput, and it wouldn't be something that could be matched by Alliance anyway, right? So it would just be completely imbalanced and unfair. And if you're having to do that much amount of throughput, who's healing the tanks, right, in that situation anyway? You're never going to run into, you're never going to be capped by your throughput. Your performance isn't going to be capped by your throughput. So that argument just never really made any sense to me, that Horde can technically pump out more HPS if needed. So what the conversation actually went back to after, we were talking about salve, and then we were talking about that, and we were talking about just the natural synergy of how between Paladin and Priest, because the Priest is trying to heal the raid, the Paladin's trying to heal the tank. It went to mana efficiency. And I was like, the person was like, well, I thought you were talking about healing and not mana. They're kind of two separate things. And I was like, well, in my opinion, a big part of the healing in Classic is actually mana, because this is not like a fast Twitch game, you know what I mean, where you need to be like spamming all sorts of abilities as a healer or something like that. You don't need insane APM or micro or anything of the sort. It's more just like, are you mana efficient? That's the way to stand out as a healer in Classic. And to kind of illustrate that, I went back and I looked up the Nax Race to World First in 2019, and I pulled up the list of flasks used for, I think, like the top 10 guilds. And if Onslaught was the first finishing Horde guild, I think they finished third. And if you look, it's like Progress, who finished first, used 10 flasks of Distilled Wisdom the entire raid. And I think Onslaught used literally 98 or something like that. And I was using that to show that, there's just a huge mana disparity. Because not only are Paladins better suited at healing the tank, and Priests are better suited at healing the raid, and shamans they're not as good as healing the raid as priests, and they're not as good as healing the tank as paladins, so they struggle in both those areas. They also struggle just in terms of mana, because they don't really have a true mana back mechanic. In fact, in a lot of cases, a lot of them are pressured to go into enhancement tree to take the Wind Fury, extra attack power and Wind Fury, which is just complete trolling, because the amount of actual damage that's adding throughout the course of an entire run in terms of percentage of the overall damage, right, is incredibly low. You can look at it as a raw number and be like, oh, look at all that damage we gain from the Wind Fury attack power, but as a percentage of the overall damage, it's just going to be so minuscule. It's not going to help your clear basically at all. And you could at least be having Mana Tide, which would do a little bit for you as Shaman. People love to hate on Mana Tide, but it is a cooldown that you can just use, and there's no downside to using it in a lot of cases unless it's replacing a Fire Resist totem or something. But, I mean, you can afford to drop it for 8 to 10 seconds, especially if it's affecting your whole group. Your your healer group can rotate. If you have a shaman, especially in a caster group, maybe you have an extra one, like 7 shamans or something like that, and you can toss that in there and get a bunch of mana back, or you can swap them mid-raid or something like that. So shamans always struggled with the mana efficiency side themselves, and it's not only that they don't have good mana regen mechanics, because as somebody mentioned, they're getting water shields, so that should help with that a little bit. Should be like 80 MP5 equivalent, assuming it's up all the time, with like 8k mana, and then like a 6k would be 60, etc., 4k 40. So it's a decent chunk of MP5, but it's nothing groundbreaking. You know what I mean? It's not going to fix their mana problems overnight, and I am pretty sure they're going to be fixing the Distilled Wisdom potting. So I think that's going to really hurt Horde and really hurt Shaman. And it's going to make it like really tough on their mana sustain. But the other thing that I was saying is that it's not only the mana that they don't have a good way to get mana back, it's that their spells tend to be quite wasteful. Obviously, Chain Heal doesn't have to do a ton of overhealing, but if you look at how the class is played in a lot of cases, especially when shamans get a little bit of gear, a little bit more mana regen, they feel kind of confident, they start ranking up that Chain Heal, and it starts doing a lot of overhealing, because they're all just kind of sending it into the clump at once. You know what I mean? And the heal common stuff doesn't really do a good job at reading, like, bounces, I would say, and stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting, because, like, people can be healing 3 members of your raid, and you can see the original chain heal coming in, and then maybe you start chain healing a different person after them, right? But the problem is their chain heal hit first, so it healed their target and like basically instantly bounced, and now your target took the secondary hit, so you're doing a bunch of overhealing, and this can have like a cascading effect, because you have to run a lot of shamans typically on Horde now. That might change a little bit in Season of Discovery, right? Because we have the Druid and stuff like that can also provide Wind Fury. But assuming you are running at least like 4 shaman or something like that, you're still going to run into this issue of like chain heal sniping, essentially, where, you know, people can't really do anything about it, but you're having like so many overlapping chain heals that you're just wasting a ton of mana. If you look at shaman logs from Era, you can often see like the overhealing is just like egregious, and typically it doesn't matter as much because they're making it up with green mana pots, but that's not going to be the case in Psalm. You're not just going to be able to pop a flask of, or a SOD most likely. I doubt you're going to just be able to pop a flask of Distilled Wisdom and get 2k mana back. And for most people, that's prohibitively expensive anyway. That's just for people who buy gold. So it's already kind of like a degenerate playstyle, to be honest. So yeah, I think people are underestimating the effect of not having that much mana from the green mana pots in the game, and how much overhealing and ineffective healing chain heal actually does, because it's sloppy. They think, oh, it's a smart heal, you know, it's seeking out low health targets, and it does, but I mean, sometimes there's just too many chain heals being cast at once is really the problem, right? It's not really the heal is not the problem. It's the player and the lack of discipline in terms of they're just like sending it out there, trying to get as much HPS as they can. As a matter of fact, I think what could be a really effective playstyle on Shaman, especially now that we have world buffs back and we have lots of crit, is you may want to be really sticking to that rank 1 chain heal, because you're going to have the additional crit, which makes it more effective, right? Because it's going to crit probably like 30% of the time now, and it can kind of make it almost seem like a rank 3 chain heal when it crits, and you're not spending the mana cost there, and you're still getting the effect in those cases, right? So you're not doing as much overhealing, you're saving mana, etc. And if you also take the overload or overcharge node, it has a 33% chance to double cast it, which I think is not going to have the it doesn't have like a great coefficient on the double casted one, so it's not scaling as well with your plus healing, but it's still doing something and adding. It's making your base chain heal a bit more effective regardless, right? So I think that may actually be kind of like the strategy that Horde might try and do to get comparative results to this alliance with the beacon, because it's just going to be insane. Like the not having to worry about your tanks also is just, I don't know, it's really not having to worry about your tanks while you're also able to spot heal the raid, right? Because like that's the main problem with Horde, is that if the priest is trying to kind of do that thing where they're being super active and saving people with shields and saving people with flash heals, they have to neglect the tank a little bit. They can't do both. They don't have beacon. The best they can do in a lot of cases is like maybe they'll put a shield on the tank so they can heal somebody else, right, to help catch up on somebody else, or they'll do vice versa. They'll shield somebody else to kind of catch up on them and then heal the tank. Or if they're healing multiple tanks because stuff has gone wrong, that's what they'll do. They'll shield one, flash heal the other, try and catch up that way, right? But they don't really have another tool to just duplicate their heals, and that's insanely powerful. Like Beacon can do that on multiple tanks, keep in mind, which is actually wild when you think about it. There was a situation back in Psalm when I was healing MC, the boss Shazra, I believe, that he does the enrage or whatever, and I think he was a bit tougher on Psalm. He wasn't really a super hard boss, but for some reason, like something had went wrong, and there was like a line of sight issue with like one of the other tank's healers. So all the ads were basically buffed. And I'm not sure if on Psalm they were like permanently buffed and you just had to heal through it, or if there was something where we weren't dragging him out. I think the strategy we used, we weren't dragging him out of the raid, and he was just buffing everything. It was like a Zug, cleave everything down type strat. And normally it worked fine, but because this other healer had messed up LOS in the tank, I was healing 2 tanks as a priest, and I actually kept them up for quite a while. But the damage from those ads when they're empowered is kind of insane, especially when you're not really that geared at the start of an expansion. And eventually one of the tanks just died. I think we ended up killing the boss anyway. But if you had a Paladin there, one of those tanks would be beaconed, and you could just be tunneling the other tank, and you can prevent wipes like that. It's such a powerful tool, and it can be swapped as well. It's going to have a mana cost, but just the ability, you don't want to be probably swapping it all the time, right? That would be super inefficient, but just the ability that it can be swapped so often is very, very powerful. So I think people are really sleeping on Beacon. They're not understanding like how powerful it is from an ease of use perspective, from increasing the Paladin's throughput. And the one that people really aren't getting is just like it's making things easier on the tank healing side while also allowing them to put their eyes everywhere else. It's truly like a you see all situation. Nothing escapes my eyes. Like I am now the the snipe god, and I'm just gonna focus on these critically low people. It's like this warrior is taking a ton of damage, and I'm tunneling him back to full. This mage just took a bunch of damage, is about to die. No, you're good. They're just gonna be like literally allowed to be the raid savior with something like Beacon in a way that they absolutely couldn't be before without, at least partially neglecting their tank. So it's gonna just make things like super easy on Alliance, I think, and ease of use, like I was saying the other day in that discussion with the person about Alliance versus Horde, ease of use is part of the equation. There's a lot of people that like to say, I think like the Onslaught people were a big proponent coming into the 2019 WoW Classic that, hey, Horde is just as good as Alliance. It's just that like you have to like play better and you have to be like more present. You can't make as many mistakes, but you can actually do a lot of damage as Horde, and that can compensate for for like the some of the advantages Alliance have. And I think especially that's going to be closer to being true in SOD. I think the power level of Horde has definitely crept up now that they'll have Salve and they'll have King, so they'll have the buffs taken away, and Shaman has gotten a bit better with the Water Shield, and the Overload is nice, and stuff like that. And there's some interesting talents in the middle with either Earth Shield or the one that allows you to do damage. You could add a nice chunk of damage to your group's pulls in some cases, which could help depending on how bosses are balanced. But I think while the gap has narrowed, I think it was never true in the first place that Horde were anywhere close to equivalent, just like stat for stat. And then on top of that, when you factor in just how much easier it is to play Alliance, that's something you have to take into account, because you can't just say like, oh, if we play perfectly, we'll be that 1% better than Alliance, or we'll be on par with Alliance. It's like, that's not good enough, right? If you're either even or slightly better for having to play perfectly, that's a bad thing. Because that's just never going to be the case. You're never going to execute perfectly, especially over the course of like a long 1 hour plus max raid or something like that. It's just not going to be the case. You're going to make mistakes and you're going to get punished harder when you're Horde, and that's simply all it is. If you have to hit the the 9 out of 10 shot like every time to stay competitive, you're going to miss it at some point when the other team just has to hit if they're getting themselves 6 out of 10 shots and you're getting every shot for you is 9 out of 10, like they're going to win the game like 9 out of 10 times, probably 10 out of 10 in most cases, right? So yeah, I think Paladin is going to be insane. If you've ever thought about playing Paladin and you had reservations because you think it was like super boring before because you just spam the tank, it's going to be, you are going to be using a lot of one heal still, I think, now, but it's, you're going to be able to target whoever the hell you want. So that's going to be really fun. It's going to be probably the strongest it's ever been by far. It's going to be easier to farm with and stuff because you can swap specs and swap runes, and now have things like Crusader Strike and Divine Storm. So that's going to be really good. So just a great time for Paladin mains, I think, in this expansion. I would honestly encourage a lot of people to go Alliance and play Paladin because it's going to be super OP. Your raid's going to be really happy. You're going to be pumping out tons of HPS. And it's going to be like a really active react to people taking damage playstyle. It's just going to be really fun. So thanks for watching. I think this caps off all of our healers. I may do a mage video because they do have some sort of legitimate healing abilities. But I think what's going to come next is going to be videos kind of like more on the state of SOM, or the state of SOD. So it's going to be videos reacting to either data mine stuff or new stuff that's been talked about in interviews. as well as kind of like just my feelings on SOD in total. I think I have a video planned about Classic Plus and what people expected, what we got, the discrepancies and stuff like that. And there's also been a lot of talk in the community about, there was never a unified idea that the community had of Classic Plus, and I want to push back against that because I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. Obviously, in some parts it's true, but I think that in a lot of cases, actually, the community was sort of unified on what they wanted, and Blizzard decided to just fucking YOLO it. But it should be fun anyways. Right, so thanks for watching the video. Stay tuned for more videos. And play Paladin, play Alliance. See you guys next time.